So this first session of the Autonomy Focus Group is devoted to David Little's model of language learner autonomy. So we're very happy and very honored to have David Little himself present his model. And Giovanna, if you want to present David, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think David Little is very well known, but maybe beside a thank you to him for presenting also a couple of words about him. He is a fellow emeritus of Trinity College in Dublin, and he has been, together with Lenny Dam and other scholars, one of the most engaged researcher and practitioners in the field of learner autonomy in second language education, but also his interest in the management. Sorry, somebody talking? And he's also engaged in researching and managing linguistic diversity in schools. And he was one of the promoters of the language learning portfolios within the Common European Framework. And among the manifold publication, we can maybe remind of the book written by himself, Lenny Dam and Lennart Legenhausen, Language Learner Autonomy, Theory, Practice, and Research. And maybe now, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. Let me begin by sharing my screen. Is that succeeded? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we do perfectly.
Okay, let me go back. I should begin, ladies, and I think there is one gentleman in the audience, by explaining how I happen to be here today. I'm very glad to have the opportunity of sharing the next couple of hours with you. It arose for the following reason. I attended the Cercle conference in Porto in September. Some of you know that, of course, and attended the meeting of the Learner Autonomy Focus Group on the first morning. And introducing that morning remotely from Berlin, Giovanna explained what the program was for the coming year, what Justine recapitulated a couple of minutes ago. And of course, I was surprised and duly flattered that my recent publication on learner autonomy was to be the first thing in focus. And so I said to Martina, who was coordinating the working group I was in, that I'd be very happy to not exactly introduce my article, but offer a talk which arises from the article. If you've already read the article, the talk doesn't repeat it. If you haven't read the article, the talk is not an appropriate substitute. But the talk was an attempt to create a presentation that would focus very much on the concerns of practitioners, but be firmly rooted in the view of language learner autonomy that I elaborate in that article. For those of you who don't know it, haven't seen it, it came out in the first issue of the Cambridge University Press journal Language Teaching this year, so February this year. And it fills the first person singular slot. Each issue has an article written by someone whose name is closely associated with one or another area of applied linguistic or language teaching research. And the invitation is to give an account that combines a certain degree of autobiography. In other words, how did you come to this area of specialization and how has your interest developed, while at the same time summarizing its main features. The talk that I'm now going to give you was originally designed for an online pre-conference event organized by the Learner Autonomy Special Interest Group of IATEFL, and I delivered that last year. So, language learner autonomy for the 21st century: definition, theoretical justification, practical implications. As always, some preliminaries. As I always insist, my work on language learner autonomy has always started from successful practice, and it sought to answer two questions. The first question is, why is this practice successful? And answering the question is a never-ending task, which entails reflecting on the successful practice in all its complexity from multiple theoretical and empirical research perspectives. The second question is, how can the success be replicated in other contexts? And this is a matter of elaborating principles that are easy to understand and straightforward to implement. Applied linguistic research, whether empirically based or theoretical, does language teaching and language teachers no service by providing them with incredibly complicated models for classroom implementation. If you want something to work in the classroom, you've got to be able to define it straightforwardly and specify it quite simply, possibly in a succession of steps. Everything I say in this talk is inspired and relatable back to my reflection on two specific learning environments. Those of you familiar with my work won't be surprised to learn that the first of those environments is Leni Dam's classroom at Karlslunde Skole. Leni was the person who first made me aware of learner autonomy as a possible classroom phenomenon, and that was back in the mid-1980s. And ever since then, we've been in close contact. And I'd be very surprised when you're focusing on Leni's work in learner autonomy in the next meeting, if you can find significant theoretical or practical differences between what she will say to you or you will read that she's written in that session and what I'm going to say today. As you know, Leni was concerned with teaching English to young Danish teenagers. And for me, this has been the paradigm case of language learner autonomy in the classroom since the 1980s when I first encountered it. The second environment is one I've become closely familiar with more recently over the last 15 years or so. And that's the environment of Skolrija Kalinis and Bridget's School for Girls, which is a primary school in one of Dublin's western suburbs. Native-born Irish and immigrant learners are focused there on English as language of schooling, Irish as the obligatory second language of the curriculum, and French, which they learn in the last 2 years. So the pupils at the school range in age from 4.5 to 12.5. And the most detailed information about what lies behind this practice is contained in the book that I published with Deirdre Cohen, formerly principal of the school, in 2019. The school has 320 pupils, more than 50 home languages. And the approach to teaching in general, but language teaching in particular, is based on encouraging immigrant pupils to use their home languages in the classroom. And I would say that that is an approach based, alternatively expressed, on inviting learners to bring their home language, and with their home language, their identity, their agency, their capacity for autonomous behavior into the center of the educational process. And I'll say a little more about that later in the talk. This is how I'm going to proceed. First of all, what do I think language learner autonomy is? How would I describe or define it? Secondly, why should we want to develop language learner autonomy? And thirdly, in necessarily general terms, how do we develop language learner autonomy? It's important that I say at this point, I think, that although I've been inspired by lower secondary learners in Karlslunde and primary learners in Dublin, the general principles I'm going to lay out for you and their practical implementation apply to language learners at all levels of proficiency and in all educational sectors. When I've done those three things, what, why, and how, I shall turn my attention briefly to the question of what kind of outcomes we can expect. And I'll illustrate the kind of outcomes we can expect on the basis of two examples, texts created by learners, but 20 years apart. And when I've done those four things, I'll conclude. So first of all, what is language learner autonomy? When I wrote the article that we've been referring to, I felt that I absolutely must begin by saying what I think this phenomenon is. And that is the first paragraph that I've divided into three by sentences, the first paragraph of that article. So for me, language learner autonomy denotes a teaching learning dynamic in which learners plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. From the beginning, they do this as far as possible in the target language, which thus becomes a channel of their individual and collaborative agency. By exercising agency in the target language, they gradually develop a proficiency that is reflective as well as communicative, and the target language becomes a fully integrated part of their plurilingual repertoire and identity. Let me elaborate on that definition sentence by sentence. First of all, language learner autonomy. It's important to begin by explaining that for me, language learner autonomy is a special case of learner autonomy, which is a general pedagogical phenomenon and a general pedagogical imperative. The term denotes a teaching learning dynamic. The operationalization of language learner autonomy depends as much on teachers as on learners. And I shall have more to say about the teacher's role a little later. It's a dynamic in which learners plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. And this is the essence of Henri Olek's definition of the autonomous learner, which I think is universally accepted. I'm not aware of any serious writing or discussion of language learner autonomy that doesn't take this concept of the autonomous learner responsible for planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating as its starting point. Now, from the beginning, the learners who are involved here do these things, planning, implementing, monitoring, evaluating, as far as possible in the target language. It's important to insist that it's this part of my definition that gives it explanatory power. Without communicative and reflective target language use, there's no necessary link between autonomy, learner autonomy, and language learning. As they plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate their learning in the target language, that target language becomes a channel of the learner's individual and collaborative agency. Agency is, of course, fundamental to autonomy, though it's less than the whole story. And in classroom learning, where you have learners who are both individuals and members of a community, agency is an individual and a collaborative phenomenon. When they exercise agency through the target language, learners develop a proficiency that is reflective as well as communicative. When they use the target language to manage their own learning in collaboration with their peers, they gradually develop metacognitive proficiency in the target language. And in this way, the target language becomes a fully integrated part of their plurilingual repertoire and identity. The Common European Framework of Reference for Languages defines plurilingualism as a communicative competence to which all knowledge and experience of language contributes, and in which languages interrelate and interact. My claim is that if learners are taught in the way implied by this definition, the languages they learn will inevitably and necessarily become fully integrated parts of their plurilingual repertoire, but also their identity. So much for definition. But why should we want to develop language learner autonomy? Why should we want to get the kind of effects I've already begun to imply this approach to teaching and learning will achieve? Let me start at the end of this definition, a fully integrated part of learners' plurilingual repertoire and identity. I think it's commonly accepted that all language teaching should aim to develop learners' capacity to use the target language autonomously, which means having access to a flexible repertoire that can be applied to the specifics of any communicative situation. And it's important to insist on the possibility of using a language autonomously, not at some unspecified point in an indefinite future, but now, as a core element driving the process of teaching and learning. And that brings me immediately to this notion of target language use as a central component in the dynamic that drives learning. All current theories of second language acquisition assign a central role to spontaneous language use. I've given you two references taken from the fairly recently published Cambridge Handbook on Language Teaching. The chapter by Ellis and Wolfe elaborates an emergentist language use-based approach to second language acquisition, whereas Truscott and Sharwood-Smith elaborate a cognitive Chomskyan approach. But for both of them, spontaneous target language use is what drives the motor of acquisition. Planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating. These are, as I've already said, recalling Henri Olek, core to an understanding of learner autonomy. But they also play an essential role in determining the kind of target language use that is going to develop the sort of proficiency I'm aiming for. Language users exercise their autonomy by taking discourse initiatives. And in the autonomy-oriented classroom, we guarantee that this happens by requiring the learners to manage their own learning. Because if they're managing their own learning, they can't help but take a share in the control of classroom discourse. By insisting that they set their own agenda, taking account, of course, of the official curriculum, we ensure that their learning is informed by their interests and engages their identity. We also ensure that it draws on and nourishes their intrinsic motivation. For self-determination theory, which is supported by an enormous body of empirical research reaching back decades, intrinsic motivation is at the very heart of all human motivation. Language learning in a classroom is, as I've already said, not only an individual, but a social process. And in life outside the classroom, there's a symbiotic relation between the autonomy of the individual and the autonomy of the group. So individual, but also collaborative agency. To the best of my knowledge, this view of the language learner and language learning that I'm elaborating is the only one that takes explicit account of the relation between language and thought, this proficiency that is reflective as well as communicative. So I've explained what I think language learner autonomy is, and I've now explained why I think all language teachers should wish to achieve the goals that it strives after. How do we go about developing it? It's important to start with the role of the teacher. Language learner autonomy requires not a changed role for the teacher. This stuff about, no longer the sage on the stage, but the guide on the side, or the teacher of manager of resources. Those things are part of the teacher's role, but what language learner autonomy requires is a complete reconceptualization of what it means to teach. At every level of proficiency and in every context of formal learning, it's the teacher's job to lead and maintain a learning conversation that is truly dialogic in the sense that it grants equal discourse rights to all participants. And the current Bible on dialogic pedagogy is Robin Alexander's latest book, published 2 years ago. How do we get our learners to plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate their own learning? How do we gradually develop in them the necessary skills? Well, the exercise and development of language learner autonomy understood in this way require clear structures and predictable routines. Learners must know in advance what is going to happen in general terms in each lesson that they attend. You need a fixed lesson plan. You need clearly articulated work cycles, planning, implementation, evaluation. And you need to provide them with tools for managing and documenting their learning. Clearly, they're going to have to write a lot of things down in order to manage their learning. Documenting their learning is fundamental if you want to encourage reflection rooted in continuing self-evaluation. And that's the role, of course, in Leni Dam's version of language learner autonomy of logbooks, portfolios, and posters. Individual and collaborative agency. Learner autonomy means not only learning how to learn, but learning how to collaborate with others. Autonomy is a matter not of independence, but of intentional, responsible, reflective interdependence. dependence. In recent years, I've come across a number of publications on language learner autonomy that start by saying it's time we gave up on the idea of autonomous learners as being independent and recognized that autonomy is a relational phenomenon, and therefore we need to focus on interdependence. Well, what people who write that reveal more than anything else is their ignorance of the history of our field, because back in 1991, I was making exactly those points, and I've never stopped making them ever since. In this business of helping learners to learn how to collaborate, it's the teacher's responsibility to negotiate with them. They need to have, for example, a share in determining strict rules for the formation of groups or for the management of group work, and other dimensions of the organization of classroom learning also need to be negotiated with the learners and given over to their control where that's possible. In the autonomy classroom, proficiency develops from the learner's attempts to use the target language, speaking, but also listening, reading, and writing, living in the present. One of the things that one can't escape noticing in an autonomy classroom is that the learners are using their target language for current purposes. They're not doing things in rehearsal for possible eventualities in the future. And in helping the learners to live in the present in the target language, the teacher is responsible for scaffolding their attempts to speak and for modeling the written forms of the language. And this is, of course, especially important in the early stages. The central role assigned to the documentation of learning, logbooks, posters, promotes a symbiotic relation between speaking in order to write. In other words, interactive speech can generate written text, and writing in order to speak, using written notes as prompts to overcome shortcomings in short-term memory in the very early stages of learning. Language learners in this kind of context gradually master the grammar of their target language by striving for orthographic accuracy. And that's exactly what happens when children learn to write their first language, or it's what happens when they learn to write their first language here in Ireland. Because learners already know at least one other language, they know how to carry out a conversation. You don't have to teach them that. They have to learn how to carry out a conversation using a different linguistic code. And because they already know at least one other language, they've got a wealth of implicit linguistic knowledge that helps them respond, usually implicitly, to the target language as system. And of course, that's what creates interference between languages, again, in the early stages mostly. Finally, this proficiency that's reflective as well as communicative, this learning dynamic in the autonomy classroom is dialogic, and that entails negotiation, reflection, and evaluation. Learners in this kind of learning environment develop a capacity for inner speech and perhaps implicit reflection in their target language because they're continuously involved in evaluative interaction. Self and peer assessment in an autonomy classroom is a matter of talk. Reflection in an autonomy classroom begins as interactive talk. And what finally becomes a metacognitive capacity is internalized, in a Vygotskian sense, is internalized from interactive communication. Well, in a very compressed way, that's what, why, and how. But what kind of results come out of learning environments that are designed and sustained rigorously in accordance with this set of principles or precepts? I can, because of limits of time, offer you only two examples of what are necessarily, well, they're two examples, not necessarily, but they are, as you'll see, convincing examples, and they're 20 years apart. The first one is a text produced by a 15-year-old Danish learner of English. So she was a member of one of Leni's classes in the mid-1990s. She was at the end of her 4th year of learning English, so she was in grade 8 and she was 15 years old. She wrote the text I'm going to share with you in response to the question, after 4 years of learning English, how would you assess your overall progress? Now, the task was therefore to write a short self-evaluation, a reflective text. And it's important to recognize the immediate nature of the task. This was a task that Leni got all the members of the class to undertake in one of her lessons. So she asked the question, and then she said to them, now, you have a few minutes to think about this, but I want you to write the answer in your logbook. So they had time to reflect briefly, then they had to write what they wanted to in answer to Leni's question. No time for elaborate preparation using dictionaries, anything like that. Whatever they wrote had to come out of their heads. They had to activate the same psycholinguistic mechanisms as underlie fluent speech. Here's the text, which I transcribed from the original without any kind of modification at all. I already make use of the fixed procedures from our diaries when trying to get something done at home. Then I make a list of what to do or remember the following day. That makes things much easier. I've also, via English, learned to start a conversation with a stranger and ask good questions. And I think that our together session has helped me to become better at listening to other people and to be interested in them. I feel that I've learned to believe in myself and to be independent. Now, I'm sure you'll have no difficulty in agreeing with me that this text evinces a powerful combination of fluency and competence. If it were produced by an Irish, that's to say native English speaker of the same kind of age, it would count as an excellent text. It demonstrates the capacity of the autonomy classroom, as I've described it, to create continuities between learning at school and life outside the classroom. I already make use of the fixed procedures from our diaries when trying to get something done at home. This is an example of a plurilingual repertoire in action. The text also demonstrates the capacity of the autonomy classroom to have an impact on general attitudes and behavior. I think that our together session has helped me to become better at listening to other people and to be interested in them. And it demonstrates the capacity of the autonomy classroom to develop learners' confidence and self-esteem. I've learned to believe in myself and to be independent. Now, Leni was asking her learners, what do you think you've learned after 4 years of English? And this girl, not untypically, is not talking about English at all. What she's talking about is the impact of the pedagogical approach that her teacher has followed on her own personal development. But it's very clear that English is a fully integrated part of her plurilingual repertoire and her linguistic identity. My second example is a text produced by a 12-year-old pupil who taught herself Spanish. The background: she was of Nigerian Russian heritage, and the language she spoke at home with her mother was Yoruba. At the time of writing the text, she's been at Scolrigia Carlini for almost 8 years. In other words, she started at the age of 4.5, went through the 2 preliminary infant years and then the 6 primary grades. She's now in 6th class, and within a few weeks of writing this text, she'll be moving on to secondary school. It's important in contextualizing the text to explain that our primary school curriculum in Ireland is very strongly oriented to learner autonomy, agency, identity. The introduction to the curriculum sets out as the central goal that pupils should realize their full potential as unique individuals. And it recognizes that the child's existing knowledge and experience form the basis for learning, and that the child is, or should be, an active agent in his or her learning. At the beginning, I mentioned that the school, with about 320 pupils, had, at the time we were studying it, more than 50 home languages. And to cope with this, the school's language policy was to include home languages in classroom communication. Tell the pupils to draw on their home languages in whatever way seems to them appropriate. Doing that necessarily engages pupils' interests and identities, and it generates great enthusiasm for language and language learning. As I said at the beginning, it draws their capacity for autonomous behavior via their home language, via their identity, into the very center of their educational experience. In general, the teaching in Scolrigia is strongly dialogic, and writing plays a key role almost from the beginning. Pupils always have a copybook in front of them, and they are constantly writing in their copybook. So copybooks fulfill many of the functions of Lenidam's logbooks, though without the strict structure. As they go through the school, immigrant pupils transfer literacy skills from English and Irish to their home languages autonomously, without benefit of instruction at school. For 2 or 3 language communities, they may attend weekend schools that are designed precisely to help them develop literacy in their home language. But the great majority of children don't have that kind of facility available, and yet they achieve very impressive levels of written proficiency in their home language. Indeed, they achieve high levels of age-appropriate literacy in English, Irish, French, and their home languages. And then, from an early age, they engage individually and collaboratively in autonomous language learning projects of their own making. With that much by way of introduction, here's the text. When Deirdre Cohen retired as principal of Scolrigia in 2015, all the pupils were organized into writing her a letter thanking her and wishing her a happy retirement. But they were asked to do that in 2 languages. And as you can see, this letter is written in Spanish, and then the Spanish bit of the text is followed by an explanation in English. Now, I've already told you that this girl's home language, as far as communication with her mother was concerned, was Yoruba, she was of Nigerian Russian heritage. There was no Spanish in her background. So when Deirdre read this letter, she decided the next time she was in the school, she would make an occasion to sit down with this girl and ask her how she came to learn Spanish. Well, it all started by going on a family holiday to Spain. And there she'd fallen in love with all things Spanish, food, music, everything. And when she got back, she decided she wanted to do something about learning the language. So she went to the school library where she found 2 books, one of them with a CD tucked in the back cover. And that gave her some practice in the sounds of the language. And then she got hold of a book to say what a chair is in Spanish or put chair into a sentence. And then she got what she describes as a verbal book to learn my nouns and proverbs and stuff like that. She doesn't mean proverbs, she means verbs, nouns and verbs. This is obviously some kind of grammar with practice, drills, exercises. When Deirdre said, do you use Google Translate? She said, well, if I want to do something quick, but usually I use my own words and I see if Google Translate can get it right. Incidentally, the evidence that, for example, I mean, this text was written in the classroom anyway, but that this text wasn't produced by Google Translate is precisely the errors that it contains. She also said that she uses Barbara and 5,000 Words in Spanish, an online resource, which gives you quizzes as well to see if you're doing well or if you should go back to another lesson. So she's aware that she needs some kind of check on progress to make sure that she's learning what she thinks she's learning. So at the age of 12, this Nigerian Russian girl is the very epitome of Henri Olek's self-instructional language learner. As you may imagine, I've used this example and also other examples that immigrant pupils have used of texts in their home languages in talks that I've given here and there. And sooner or later, someone, usually a professor, says, but how do you know the language they write is correct? And the last time I was asked that question, I thought, well, I'm going to find an answer to that. So I sent this text to a friend of mine who used to be a professor of Spanish at one of the Scottish universities. And this is what he wrote. I'd have been quite happy to receive this text from one of my ab initio undergraduates, in other words, from a student of 18 or 19 who was beginning to learn Spanish from scratch as the first step in taking a degree course in Spanish. He goes on, from a primary school pupil, it displays an exceptional degree of sophistication, notably in the confident command of the subjunctive mood of verbs in negative requests. Not perfect, of course, 2 major sources of error, lapses in agreement, inconsistency in the use of the polite and informal second person pronouns. And these errors, of course, as I said a moment ago, are what demonstrate that it wasn't done by using Google Translate. And he thinks the inconsistency in pronoun use is probably the point at which there's most obvious interference from English. And now this pupil, like Lenie's pupil, can use, in this case, Spanish confidently, fluently, and mostly accurately to express her own meanings. So through her own efforts, Spanish has become a fully integrated part of her linguistic and cultural identity. Time to wind up. First of all, let me summarize what I've said about language learner autonomy and its operationalization as I understand it. In all contexts of formal learning, and at all levels of proficiency, language learner autonomy depends on the same basic pedagogical principles. Teachers engage their learners in a learning conversation that is dialogic. Discourse initiatives are shared by all participants, and the learning conversation naturally leads to collaboration and group work. From the beginning, the conversation is conducted in the target language, though no attempt is made to suppress the learner's proficiency in other languages. Teachers engage their learners' interests and identities in the learning process by requiring them to manage and document their own learning. Learning proceeds in clearly articulated cycles: planning, implementing, evaluating. Learning is framed by reflective evaluation so that learners develop a proficiency that is metacognitive as well as communicative, because, of course, the reflective evaluation is carried out from the beginning in the target language. These principles describe Leni Dam's classroom. And in the article published earlier this year, I devoted several pages to a very close description of the procedures of Leni's classroom that I checked with her before I finalized the text. They're mostly implicit in Skalrija Kalini, where dialogic teaching is shaped by close adherence to the principles that underlie the autonomy-oriented primary school curriculum, and, as I've put it, the use of home languages as central features of the educational dynamic draws the learner's autonomy, their agency, into the center of their experience of learning at school. In both environments, language learning outcomes greatly transcend what is generally considered to be possible. I've only given you 2 examples, but if you just look through the 2 books that I cited at the beginning of this talk, Language Learner Autonomy, Theory, Practice, and Research from 2017, and then the 2019 book that I wrote about Skalrija with engaging with linguistic diversity that I wrote with Deirdre Cohen, you will find multitudes of examples that make the same case. Outcomes that greatly transcend what is considered to be possible. But what about the bigger picture? Since the 1970s, the concept of learner autonomy has inspired pedagogical innovation and research, mostly in language education, and one might add mostly in Europe. But Henri Olek's 1979 report that I've been citing in the Pergamon edition of 1981 was written under the aegis of a major Council of Europe project on adult education in general. According to the final report on that project, adult education should foster a new type of cultural production by taking the real problems of everyday life into account in carrying out the educational process. In other words, according to this Council of Europe project, very much under the influence of French thinking at the time, the idea was that adult education should be carried out in a synergetic relation with the day-to-day context of the adult learners engaged in the process. In terms of practical approaches, the report suggested that adult education should be based on self-learning. In other words, self-instruction, in other words, in that sense, autonomy. Self-learning generally refers to the practice of working in groups and to the choice by participants of objectives, curriculum content, and working methods and pace. Now, in the second half of that quotation, you can see the essence of Henri Olek's characterization of the autonomous learner or autonomous learning. The first part is noteworthy because it emphasizes working in groups, and working in groups is not a part of Olek's 1979 account of learner autonomy. Working in groups, the report says, implies the possibility of dialogue. In other words, self-learning must be the result of an interpersonal dialectical dialogue. The bold italics are mine because that phrase, interpersonal dialectical dialogue, even though the report puts it in parentheses, for me captures the essence of the teaching-learning dynamic that is necessary if one wants to operationalize language learner autonomy. Adult education, in this way, pursued according to these principles, becomes an instrument for arousing an increasing sense of awareness and liberation in man, and of course, in woman. In other words, adult education that is rooted in the autonomy, the agency of the learner, and seeks to extend that autonomy or agency is transformative. And transformative is an epithet that I would attach both to the experience of learners in Leonie Dam's classroom and to the experience of pupils attending Skolriga Kalini. It seems to me, and I've really just already made this point in different terms, that according to this account, adult education should be shaped by exactly the same principles as shape language learner autonomy, as I understand it. Now, for the last half century, general pedagogical reform has pointed in the same direction for schooling, but also for higher education. For schooling, I've already referred to Robin Alexander's 2020 book, which sums up decades of work on the theory and practice, the empirical exploration of dialogic pedagogy. And if you're not familiar with this book, I strongly recommend it. Hannon and Peterson's slightly more recent book focuses on schooling in general, but is arguing for the same kind of general approach. And then in higher education, the collection of papers edited by Gordon Wells and Anne Edwards. Finally, what about the future? There are abundant examples of innovative pedagogies that achieve transformative learning outcomes of the kind that I have attributed to my version of language learner autonomy. When I was preparing this talk, 2 books within reach on the bookshelf beside me, Ken Robinson and Lou Aronica's Creative Schools, Revolutionizing Education from the Ground Up, and a rather different kind of book, Beryl Gilroy, Black Teacher, which was republished last year, having been first published back in the 1970s. Robinson and Aronica, if you don't know the book, offer a series of case studies, schools of very different kinds in very different contexts, but all achieving transformative outcomes. Beryl Gilroy also achieved transformative outcomes, but first for herself and then for those she taught. She was born and brought up and educated in the West Indies and qualified as a primary teacher there, then came to London with her husband and had to go through some form of retraining in order to qualify as a primary teacher, but then became a highly influential teacher and more generally member of the teaching profession. But the difficulty with cases like these is that they tend to focus on unusually gifted individuals, and they don't unpick their classroom behavior in the kind of principled way that I've attempted in this talk. And that makes replication highly problematic. If schools, colleges, and universities are to put learner agency at the center of the educational process, and it's at the center of the educational goals recently elaborated by the OECD, then they need to follow clear pedagogical principles that are embedded in and supported by ongoing research. There's a great deal that language teachers can learn, as I said a couple of minutes ago, from general pedagogical theory and research, especially for me, this work on dialogic pedagogy carried out by Robin Alexander. But at the same time, there's much that general pedagogical theory can learn from the theory and practice of language learner autonomy, as I've described them in this talk. Will that happen? Well, I'm not hugely optimistic. When I started out with learner autonomy, after my first encounter with Leni Dam and listening to her describing and showing what happened in her classroom, since then, there's been an awful lot of talk about it, and people keep coming up with what you describe as models. But how much impact do they have beyond the immediate context in which they're developed? Well, I shan't be around to find out. There are 2 pages of references. There's page 1, and there's page 2. But if you want to get anything from them, I suggest you wait until the recording is available on the website and then consult that. That's all from me. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and hand back to Giovanna and Justine.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, David.